Passing Clouds. Chapter 2. The Proposition. Weeks had passed since that fateful night, and Scott Daniels had tried his best to forget the encounter with Masai. But every now and then, the memory would sneak up on him, unbidden and unwelcome, like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. He'd taken refuge in his usual distractions, work, the gym, and a string of dates with women who were all too eager to feed his ego. Yet, something was off. None of it felt the same anymore, and he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that had taken root since that night. On one such evening, Scott found himself sitting alone in his luxurious living room, the silence of the house pressing in on him. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten all day. Too tired to cook and not in the mood for dining out, he decided to order in. He grabbed his phone, scrolled through a food delivery app, and picked a fancy restaurant nearby. After placing the order, he leaned back into his plush sofa, flipping through TV channels absent-mindedly as he waited. When the doorbell rang, Scott pushed himself up with a groan, heading towards the door. He opened it to find a delivery person standing there with a large brown bag in hand. She had her head down, rummaging through the contents of the bag as she listed them off. 1 truffle pasta, Caesar salad, and a bottle of sparkling water, she said, her voice professional and calm. Scott folded his arms, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance. There was something familiar about her, the way she moved, the tone of her voice, but he couldn't quite place it. He stared at her intently, his gaze lingering as she prepared to hand over the food. It wasn't until she finally looked up to pass the bag to him that their eyes met. Her brow furrowed slightly as she studied his face, a flicker of recognition crossing her features. "Do I know you from somewhere?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Scott allowed a small, knowing smile to play at the corners of his lips. "You could say that," he replied coolly. "You're the lawyer, right? The one I ran into a few weeks ago. In my Ferrari." Her eyes widened as the memory clicked into place. "Oh," she said, her tone flat as realization dawned on her. "You're the guy who tried to pick me up like I was a prostitute." Scott winced slightly at her bluntness, but he quickly recovered, his grin turning a little sheepish. "Yeah, that would be me." Masai arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Well, at least you remember. I wasn't sure if you kept track of all your little encounters." Scott's grin faded as he noticed the distinct lack of amusement in her voice. "So you're delivering food now? I thought you were a lawyer." Masai shrugged, shifting the bag to her other hand. "I am. This is just something I do in my downtime. A hobby, you could say." "A hobby," Scott echoed, unable to hide his skepticism. "Delivering food is your hobby." "It gets me out of the office," Masai replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "Not that it's any of your business." She glanced at her watch, clearly eager to leave. "Anyway, I've got more deliveries to make, so if you'll just sign for this—" "Wait," Scott interrupted, a sudden idea forming in his mind. "How about you stay and cook for me instead?" Masai blinked, caught off guard by the request. "Excuse me?" "My parents are coming over tomorrow," Scott continued, his tone casual, as if this was a perfectly reasonable request. "I could use someone like you to cook for us. You could even pass as my girlfriend. It would make the whole evening go a lot smoother." Masai stared at him in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for the right words. "Are you serious?" Scott nodded, misreading her shock as hesitation. "I'll pay you. $5,000 just like that night." Masai's expression hardened, and she took a step back. "I'm not for hire," she said firmly, her voice cold. "And I don't appreciate you thinking you can buy me, or anyone else, for that matter." All right, Scott said quickly, sensing he was losing control of the situation. "How about 10,000? Just a few hours of your time, that's all I'm asking." Masai shook her head, her gaze now filled with something closer to pity than anger. "What kind of manners do you have, Scott? You think you can buy anyone if the price is right? Is that how you treat all women?" Scott opened his mouth to respond, But the words caught in his throat. No one had ever spoken to him like this before. No one had ever dared to question him so directly. "I bet you wouldn't try this nonsense with a man," Masai continued, her tone sharp. That struck a nerve. Scott's eyes flashed with indignation. "What's that supposed to mean?" Masai gave him a tight-lipped smile, sarcasm dripping from her next words. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I hurt your feelings?" Scott's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his frustration mounting as he realized he was once again being outmaneuvered by this woman. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Masai glanced over her shoulder at her bike, parked a few feet away. "I'm done here. Enjoy your meal." She turned to leave, but Scott wasn't ready to let her go just yet. "You know," he called after her, desperation creeping into his voice, "I could give you a bad review. It wouldn't take much to get a refund, you know." Masai paused, then slowly turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. "Go ahead," she said calmly. "Write whatever you want. I'll even help you get that refund if it makes you feel better." Scott was stunned. He had never met anyone who was so completely unfazed by his attempts to exert control. It was infuriating. As she walked away, Scott found himself following her, his steps quickening as he tried to keep up. "You're really just going to walk away?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly in pitch. Masai didn't bother to answer. She reached her bike, swung a leg over it, and started the engine. The sound of the motor filled the air as she adjusted her helmet. Scott watched her, a mixture of anger and helplessness twisting in his gut. He had never felt so powerless, so completely stripped of his usual confidence. Masai didn't look back as she revved the engine and pulled away, leaving him standing alone on his doorstep. He stared after her, his fists still clenched, frustration radiating off him in waves. His thoughts churned as he tried to process what had just happened. It wasn't just the rejection that stung, it was the way she had completely dismissed him, as if he were nothing more than an annoyance, a mere blip on her radar. Scott stood there for a long time after she had gone, the cooling night air doing little to soothe his bruised ego. Never in his life had he been treated like this. Women usually fell over themselves to please him, to be part of his world. But not Masai. She had seen right through him, and worse, she didn't care. As he finally turned and walked back into his house, Scott couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of inadequacy. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, especially his relationships with women. But Masai had shattered that illusion with little more than a few well-placed words and a refusal to play along. He sat down at his dining table, the untouched bag of food in front of him. For the first time in a long while, Scott didn't feel hungry. Instead, he felt something he couldn't quite place, something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. For all his bluster and bravado, Scott Daniels was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the man he thought he was. And that thought, more than anything, was what truly terrified him.